Hey there, welcome to the podcast. Chief Meteorologist Kendra Kent here with Whether or Not and to What Degree. And today we have a very special guest, Jessica Stumpf with Greenville County Emergency Management. This is someone you probably have seen on our air a few times. She's in charge of quite a bit when it comes to preparing folks in Greenville County and getting us through disasters, emergencies. It's a big job and we're excited to have you, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. I get to, talk with you on National Weather Service chat or through some of those meetings, but it's really nice to get to sit down and talk with you today.
Yeah, we get a little bit more time on podcasts. They're not as limited as when we're on television. We don't need a quick sound bite or I always talk about it's fun when we can discuss weather topics for longer than that 3-minute little segment we get for our full weather cast. So that's always a bonus. I don't have to censor myself quite as much. So, but first off, let's start off by talking about your role with Greenville County Emergency Management. I know it's actually changed over the last few years. You were promoted to Deputy Director, correct?
That's right. I came to Greenville County Emergency Management in January of 2017 as a planning coordinator. And what that meant was I was in charge of coordinating and editing and updating the county's emergency operations plan. And that plan deals with a lot of different things. A lot of different county agencies and organizations have a role in that. So I started out as the planning coordinator, and then I was promoted to Deputy Director in August of 2019. And we are a smaller office. We're not a huge office. A lot of people think of emergency management as your FEMA. Well, FEMA has a lot of people. We don't have a whole lot of people. So our office is staffed with a director, deputy director, a training and exercise coordinator, a preparedness coordinator, a community relations coordinator, a program coordinator, and a special operations coordinator. So there's 7 of us in total.
Wow. And it's a lot. And I was thinking about the fact that right around when you became deputy director seems to be when our weather, for lack of better wording, really went bonkers around here. I feel like we've had a lot of crazy stuff. And then, of course, add a pandemic in, and I can only imagine how hard that's made your job. One of the first things I thought about when I was looking into this interview was asking you about this time last year, how that was for you. I know you and I both participated in the National Weather Service conference a couple of weeks ago, talking about our roles in that tornado outbreak. But, the ongoing pandemic had to have made that incredibly difficult for you to get information to the public. We already had a huge news story going on, and then we have to be like, oh, and by the way, a bunch of tornadoes are coming too.
That's right. And I think one of the ways to think about what emergency management is and what it does is we're kind of a coordinating agency. We coordinate people, we coordinate information, and we coordinate resources. So there's always a lot of things going on all at once. And when I think back to this time last year, this was a time when a lot of people were working from home. A lot of people's lives were kind of a lot different, and we had to move to basically a new normal is what we had to do. Working remotely, not being in contact with one another. Zoom meetings were a little more frequent, phone calls, text messages, whatever way we could communicate that wasn't in person. And so not only were we dealing with COVID, and at that time last year, there was a, kind of a shortage of PPE. So trying to get that personal protective equipment to all the agencies and organizations that might need it, especially the ones in the healthcare sector. So, EMS, hospitals, long-term care facilities. So we're focusing on that, and we're focusing on testing. We had a first responder and healthcare provider COVID test site that was up and running during this time. So we had volunteers from our county emergency response team helping out with that. And those are volunteers that work in law enforcement, fire, and EMS. We had a lot of people who were still continuing to have to do their job in this situation. But when you talk about the April 13th tornado outbreak across South Carolina, that was an interesting mixture, because this was really, we're getting into the pandemic, trying to stay socially distanced. We want to make sure people are aware of what's going on. And because that was an overnight event, that was a little bit different here across the Carolinas. We're kind of used to that daytime heating, late afternoon, evening showers and thunderstorms. That's when they really become severe. But making it overnight was a bit of a challenge. And we talked about that in terms of the forecast and trying to get that message across to everybody. But even in the response and then in the recovery phase of it, life safety is a priority when these things happen. And COVID is definitely, at this point last year, we're still learning a lot about it. It was scary. We're still trying to learn about this virus and how it impacts people and how quickly it can be spread amongst people. So yeah, we had a lot going on around this time last year.
Well, and you did an amazing job. I feel like it was just it was a time for all of us that just seemed surreal. I mean, especially if you work in this line of work, especially covering news, covering emergencies, covering weather. I remember coming in and covering all of that, and we had multiple meteorologists in the studio, and we were doing our best to social distance, and you know, I'd try to put on my mask when I wasn't on the green wall trying to talk about everything, and you know, that was the hardest thing, I think, was just not knowing exactly what was safe. We were just basically going on what we best knew. We were trying to sanitize, and I feel like that event especially was hard just because it was at night, and to communicate to people how important it is to have a way to get warnings. I think that was, you know, that was probably the trickiest thing, because I mean, we just don't, like you said, daytime heating. That's what usually drives severe thunderstorms and tornadoes for us. And I think the general public, it's really hard to grasp that a massive tornado could roll through at 3 in the morning. I mean, the time when it's hardest to communicate with anyone.
Absolutely. And it's not just having one way to receive warnings, it's having multiple ways to receive warnings. That way, if one does not work, you've got another one that's going to back it up. So I think, you know, that's very important. It's one of the things we preach a lot, is that you have to have multiple ways to receive severe weather info. And we did up until that event. Even to our partners, we were sending out, you know, daily or twice daily updates saying, hey, like, this could be really bad. Make sure, you know, you and your people are prepared. Make sure your family's prepared. Have multiple ways to receive weather information, because this is going to come through when most people are sleeping. So you have to have something that's going to wake you up in the middle of the night. It can't just be your phone's on silent and you have an app push alert.
Right.
It's got to be something else. Something else has to be able to wake you up.
I know. And I feel like the age of the weather radio, I feel like people don't buy those as much as they used to. You know, that's just it. I worked in Arkansas, Oklahoma area where those are very common. But I feel like here people don't buy those as much. It's not as you know, at least urgent in folks' eyes. But I think after the last couple of years, those probably are selling a little bit better. And you know,
I hope they are.
I do too.
I hope they are, because of, you know, cell towers are one thing, and that it's great that we have cell phones and we're able to get all this information right at our fingertips, but the weather radios are a little bit different, not exactly pinging off the servers. So that kind of allows, you know, a better way or another way to receive information. And even if your power goes out, there's a battery backup on that. So you'll still be able to get the warnings then. So I still think a weather radio is one of the top ways that you should be receiving severe weather info.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's all part of having those multiple ways of getting your warnings, and in the middle of the night, just, you know, so scary. And another scary thing that I was thinking about that I didn't realize you were so involved with was back when you, okay, correct me if I'm wrong, I know you worked for South Carolina Emergency Management and had to deal with the flooding from Matthew. I mean, tell us a little bit about what that was like. That was, what, 6 years ago now?
So Matthew was really interesting because this case, we had experimental storm surge watches and warnings issued for the South Carolina coast. And I don't know if you remember this, but they were experimental during the season for Matthew. And after Matthew, I was able to set up and go with the National Hurricane Center director and the storm surge unit to go down and survey the storm surge damage along the coast of South Carolina. So we made stops in Horry, Georgetown, and Beaufort counties to look at the storm surge damage, which is incredible when you see what the force of water can do, like how it just breaks up concrete and how it exposes seawalls that you didn't even know were there in the first place, how it moves, you know, a boat from 4 miles from its dock into the middle of an airport runway. Like, it's crazy to see what the power of water can do. But it was interesting to go along with the storm surge unit because I was able to see how they verified their forecast for the storm surge along the coast. And then the following year is when storm surge watches and warnings became operational. They were actually products that the National Hurricane Center used. So I think that was one of the really cool out of Hurricane Matthew. But during the actual event itself, I was responsible for the state's public information phone system, which meant I had 3 phone banks that I was in charge of getting information out to. So anytime there's a big disaster in South Carolina, they open up the public information phone system, and you can call this number and ask questions, and it'll go to one of 3 call centers. One is at South Carolina Emergency Management, there's another at United Way, and there's one at the DMV. So all these volunteers come in and answer phone calls. So I was responsible for getting information out to all of them so that they all had the same information no matter where the call went.
That is incredible. And I'm so, I'm so interested in knowing, what brought you into this, because that's a lot of pressure for someone to have on them when you're dealing with emergencies. This must be, I'm guessing, maybe as a child, you probably loved the weather. And then maybe when you were doing the weather, you got into the wanting to help people even more phase. Like, what got you into, because honestly, I think of what you went through and what you've had to deal with, and I can't imagine the level of stress that you do deal with. Maybe stress is a bad word, but just the pressure and the urgency of every situation. Tell me a little bit about kind of how you came into that.
Sure. And like you said, I was one of those kids who loved the weather growing up. I learned about my hometown. I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I grew up in Niles. An F5 tornado went through my hometown the year before I was born, killed 8 people in my hometown. So that's where I kind of started to learn a little bit about weather. And if you ask my mom, you are the kind of kid who would watch the Weather Channel as opposed to Sesame Street. So I was watching the Weather Channel. Everyone was always asking me what the forecast was going to be. Everyone got me, my little own weather station as a kid, as a birthday present, type situation. And so I decided, this is what I'm going to do for college. I'm going to get my degree in meteorology, and that's what I did. So I went to Penn State, got my meteorology degree there. I graduated a couple of years before Nicole, so we kind of passed each other while we were there. So, but I mean, now Nicole and I talk about it, now that we're both out and, we're living in the same place, we talk about our time at Penn State a lot. And we, watch football games together, that kind of thing. But, I went through, the program at Penn State, which was a fantastic meteorology program. And I did an internship at a TV station between my junior and senior year. And I wasn't really sure that was the way I wanted to go. I kind of wanted to do research, but I just really wasn't sure what was going to happen. So I ended up being asked, graduated in December of 2008, and I was asked by the chief meteorologist at WTAJ in Altoona if I would be willing to fill in on Sunday nights and, whenever during the week for a few months because they were short staffed. So I said, sure, kind of started thinking, I'm not sure this is the route I want to keep going. So how can I still use my meteorology degree? But TV form. And so coincidentally, this is where it's a small town type thing. The Horry County emergency manager, Randy Webster, I actually grew up with his cousin's kids in Northeast Ohio. She told me, she's like, hey, my cousin's the county emergency manager there. Why don't you talk to him? That's what I did.
That's crazy, though, the coincidence to have that connection in Horry County and to be able to segue in. My biggest I think what I always tell people is don't, if you start something and it doesn't feel like 100% your thing, there's no reason you have to keep pushing forward. I was a cell and molecular biology major in college. I mean, and I still love biology, but I realized toward the end that wasn't what I loved. And I always loved watching the Weather Channel as a kid. I had that, that same excitement for the weather, and I finally decided to go for it too. But it's just funny how I think sometimes we feel like once we've started something, we have to, finish it out. And I feel like that's a really good message for young people. If you get into something you don't feel like it's right, use the tools you've gotten so far and see where else it can take you. And you're a perfect example of that.
Well, and it doesn't have to be forever. Whatever you decide to do, it doesn't have to be forever. But I felt like I gave it a good 3 shots, and then I decided, you know what? I don't think this is the right move for me. So figure out what would be the right move, and I'm very happy that I made that decision. It's scary when you're not sure where you're headed next or the unknown. That's scary. But I'm really glad that I took that leap of faith and decided this is what I'm going to do. I'm very happy where I am now.
Yeah, well, Greenville County is lucky to have you, and thank you so much for being with us today. I always forget that you and Nicole were so close at Penn State, and I'm sure you root on the football team like crazy. It's been a pretty good couple years for you guys.
That's right. We do get together on occasion and watch a couple of football games. So it's always good to see her when we do.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We certainly appreciate it. And hopefully we will not have to deal with any major events or collaborate anytime soon. But I know if we do, you always help things run very, very smoothly.
Let's hope not. We're always preparing for what's next. next. And I mean, even if there's not something going on, there's always something we're preparing for. We're training, we're exercising, we're always doing something. The more that we get to plan and train, I think the better.
I agree. And I think that's the other thing to emphasize is that when it is calm, it's not like you guys are kicking up your feet and saying, we're good. You know, this is probably the most important time for you, is getting people prepared. And we appreciate that so much. So we will be, I'm sure, in touch. And thanks again for joining us for the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.